Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's SecurityBoulevard.com webinar, brought to you by Techstrong. My name is Cody J. Brown. I'm the host of Techstrong Learning. We have an exciting panel ahead, but first I have just a couple of housekeeping notes. First, today's session is being recorded, so if you miss any of our show, or you'd like to rewatch or share with a friend, the on-demand recording will be made available shortly after we conclude our live session. If you have any questions, we want you to send those in using the Q&A tab on the right side of the screen. And for any other comments or suggestions, anything you'd like to say to your fellow audience members, we want you to use the chat tab. And finally, before we conclude our webinar, we will be giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards, so be sure to stick around till the very end. So our topic today is defending against emerging ransomware threats. And joining me is Chris Rogers, technology evangelist at Zerto, a Hewlett-Packard enterprise company, and Jeremy Capel, VP and Chief Information Security Officer at Everbridge. Joining us to moderate today's conversation is Mike Vizard, Chief Content Officer here at Techstrong Group. So Jeremy, Chris, Mike, welcome. Thank you all for joining us. And Mike, I'll let you take it from here.
Great. Hey, thanks, Cody, and thanks, everybody, for joining us. Let's just jump right in. I mean, the topic is defending against emerging ransomware threats. And this isn't new in terms of we've been dealing with ransomware now for years. I think we've all come to terms with that reality. But Jeremy, how are the threats changing or evolving, and what should we be thinking about from here?
Thanks, Mike. I think for myself personally and what I've seen in the industry, two things jump to mind in terms of the evolution of ransomware. And one of the fundamentals of receiving ransomware is through the mechanism of phishing. And what we've seen a lot in this evolution is people have been used to looking for phishing emails that probably have some bad spelling in them. They're auto-generated, and they're being distributed to masses. Today's day and age, there is a significant shift where let's call it the threat actor, has funding behind them, capabilities behind them that they just didn't have in the past previously. So what we're starting to see is firstly a significant increase in the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning to go and scrape social media accounts. People don't really understand how valuable the information is that they have publicly available, and automatically and instantaneously craft personalized phishing attempts and tackles to individuals based on their public information. And with the power of workloads, you can produce thousands of these within seconds. So what we're seeing is a lot more tailored, targeted phishing attempts that lead you to ransomware, but they're targeted to these masses using AI and ML. Another thing that's popped or grown significantly that we've been able to see, at least, is the use of ransomware outside the traditional scope of locking down a data set and holding you ransom to try and get some form of compensation, whether that be Bitcoin or whatever it is that you're paying. We're starting to see the use of ransomware in hybrid attacks when it comes to things like physical and digital security, or hybrid attempts to attack environments and critical infrastructure. A good example of this would be, if we take a look at the recent Ukrainian crisis, we were able to see the emergence of a new wiper virus called the Hermetic wiper virus, which basically is the exact same thing as a ransomware, goes into the environment, but instead of encrypting it, it just deletes everything. And that was held back for a few months and released at a particular point in time when an attack was taking place on DDoS infrastructure for critical infrastructure services, and deployed at the exact same time. So we're used in hybrid then to fundamentally distract individuals so that a physical attack or physical advancement became easier in that particular scenario. So what we're definitely seeing is two things: is the inclusion of artificial intelligence and machine learning, as well as the combination of utilizing ransomware to either distract or bring down environments to make hybrid attacks far easier.
Chris, are you seeing similar things? Does that jive with you, or are there other types of attacks we should be looking at?
No, I completely agree. Definitely the kind of like the spear phishing attempts, if you will. Not just going after everyone with a big net with the same the same net, going after those individuals in a company who are more valuable, and then knowing who they report to and knowing what information they have, and as Jeremy said earlier, really targeting those individuals and making the biggest impact they possibly can in the organization. And yeah, I think we have moved on from the traditional, I say traditional, but the old ransomware attacks where it's just I want 50 bitcoins and I'll give you your data back. Now we're still seeing that on a really large scale. We're also seeing these more targeted attacks where they are going after, as you said, national critical national infrastructure. Colonial Pipeline being one of them in the US, right? It wasn't really about the getting the money or getting the ransom. It was actually to see what damage they could cause and see everything else like that, right? The ransom was one part of it, but it was actually to see what impact they could have and being used as political tools, military tools, now all these types of things, because we rely on cyber and rely on IT and infrastructure so much for pretty much everything we do in our daily lives. It can have a massive impact if we take down rail networks or transports, or there's ransomware attacks in Europe that have affected hospital systems, which means people got diverted to the wrong hospitals in ambulances and things like that, right? It's not just about the Bitcoin and the quick wins for these guys now. It's really becoming a much bigger problem than that. And not just, you can't just pay now and get out of jail with that way. It's not as simple as that anymore. People will be like, okay, I want 50, 100, 10,000 Bitcoin, wherever it may be. Oh wait, now I want some more, and I want some more, and I want some more, and it's a never-ending thing, right? It's also about the impact they can have rather than just getting the ransom. So yeah, completely agree that they're getting more frequent and also more severe in what they're trying to do. And as Jeremy said, combining multiple different types of attacks. So you think you're getting attacked by DDoS in one thing, and you've got your DDoS protection working over here, but then on the other side, someone's doing something else that you maybe haven't seen before, or you're not particularly well versed in, and you lo and behold, you think you've done really well with patting yourself on the back, and suddenly all your files are deleted on the other side because you weren't looking in that way at that time. So yeah, these hybrid attacks becoming very common as well.
Jeremy, do you think that some of these attacks, when they become more targeted, are aimed at higher value individuals and maybe higher value applications, and there's going to be more programmatic attacks where, if I look at the history of these attacks, they've been brute force, but I wonder if we're going to start seeing people using more remote code execution type of tools to insert stuff into applications and go after specific people? Because that's a lot of effort, I'll grant you, but it seems like the bad guys are getting better skills all the time.
Yes, as I said, the threat actor has changed. There are businesses that are multi-million-dollar businesses out there that are just put there to be able to do things like distributed denial of service attacks, botnet attacks, but now also the evolution of ransomware in the same direction, because not only is ransomware disruptive, but you can actually get premiums, but it can also be utilized to go and perform some other act in terms of that disruption in some form of combination, even as a distraction, as Chris just mentioned, for an attack. I personally think that what's really happening here as well is we're evolving as a society into what I like to call the digital decade. And I know Europe itself is putting together a whole strategy around how do they actually secure for this digital decade. If you start to think about ransomware, it was something that would go into a corporate IT system, lock up some corporate information, and then basically hold that ransom. Let's think how society is starting to shift at the moment. We're moving to an era where identity is online. Soon you're going to be able to have your passport in your iPhone, just like you've got in your wallet, and it be considered verifiable by being able to scan and utilize it. And that's just around the corner. So that's not something that's super far-fetched. We're also getting a big emergence across the globe in things like e-government. So having e-government identity and access to all of your government services. So just start to think about the data that's transferring there. The social media aspect and your personal information, PII used to be defined, and it was really something around identifying you as an individual, and that is what we're worried about, someone stealing it. However, if we start to look at what's going on at the moment, we're getting a real shift towards things like behavioral analytics. So instead now, if you've got a Garmin watch, I know the route you can actually, if I have that information, I know the route you go running in the morning. I know where you stop off before you drop your kids at school. So as you can see, the content of the data that we're starting to use in just society is fundamentally more valuable. And it's more valuable and more dangerous to be exposed. The other aspect, going back to what Chris said, which I really do believe in, is as we move into the digital decade, we're shifting and we're digitizing critical infrastructure. Now, in order to understand this, critical infrastructure was traditionally built with SCADA machines and PLCs that basically control all these mechanical components, but they were isolated, closed networks not connected to the internet. They were also built by engineers, not IT people. And engineers in those days were perfectly fine with having it run on a old DOS system as long as it performs the function that it needs to perform with very limited security, because no one's going to get in there because you need 6 badges to actually get through the doors to where you need to be. But now every engineer wants to be able to operate, manage, and monitor those devices online, exposing them globally. So that's all probably one of the bigger weak points you actually have is critical infrastructure that's on more archaic environments. That's growing significantly. So as our society evolves, the risk increases. And then to your point around remote execution and the evolution over there is, I would have to say remote code execution is something that's been around for decades. I remember being 17 years old, doing my first points of hacking, and you would basically utilize something called a reverse TCP connection, which is it's basically getting the computer that you're attacked to go through legitimate paths onto the internet and go and look for actions that it needs to perform. So instead of you coming and sending traffic to tell it what to do, which can be picked up by firewalls, it's going through a legitimate path to a website and looking for instructions. And that's a good example of remote code execution. You're getting code on the PC itself that you've compromised to go and do stuff or to move laterally with environments. So it's always been part of the hacking approach, whether you're doing a buffer overflow, whether you're adding extensions to go and execute that in the back end, creating a remote shell that you have the ability to connect to. I think, to your point though, in ransomware, it's becoming way more prominent and way more complicated. So people are investing a lot more in this. So the abilities and capabilities that they're able to execute on your PC without you knowing, and without even being detected by any of your antivirus or anything like that, because they run in performance shells that you can't really detect. They're becoming way more sophisticated because the attacker is becoming more sophisticated, has the funding, and has the reason to do it.
Mm-hmm. And those attackers are like any other business. They keep making money and they plow money back into the business and they get more sophisticated as they go along, right?
Absolutely.
They're full-blown syndicates.
All right.
Yeah.
Chris, we've been telling people that the only sure way to defend against ransomware for years now is you should have a pristine copy of your data somewhere that you can download and reinstall and hopefully, and reinflate all your applications and not lose your data. And yet almost not a day goes by where we don't run into somebody who's a victim of ransomware. So what is the disconnect? Where does this thing fall apart in sense of, if backup isn't going to do it for everybody? Is it just that A, people don't do it, or B, they do it poorly and the data is corrupted, or what goes wrong?
I think all of the above, to be honest with you. I think people for years, ever since data was brought in, we needed to back it up, but no one really took it seriously as much as they should do. There's very good organizations out there who do, and they're the ones that are more successful in recovering from these types of attacks. I think legacy backup is a bit outdated for ransomware now. Legacy backup is for files, folders, VM files and things like that. When you're talking about large enterprises with thousands of people employed by them and probably tens of thousands of virtual machines and Kubernetes clusters and everything else that they have, restoring file by file or VM by VM is just going to be too slow, too problematic, and be too cumbersome. So I see ransomware as more in the disaster area, right? It's more like it's probably the biggest disaster your company's ever going to have, and probably the most likely that it's going to have. So I think being able to recover at scale is really important, because these organizations who are, as we said, that the attacks are getting more severe and they're going after bigger targets now, right? I suppose it's a bit like a company growth, right? You get your first deal in after you're in your startup, and you start going after bigger and bigger accounts, and that's what these guys are doing, right? They're growing from small SMBs where they've got a single firewall that hasn't been touched for 15 years, right? And they've just got any open, and they've managed to get through to that, and now they're going after these remote code executions and being undetectable. So as we get to these things at scale, we need to be able to recover at scale as well. So that's important. So I think kind of relies now on disaster recovery, so making sure we can recover our minimum viable business at least, in a good time frame. We don't have to recover every single file and folder within a couple of minutes. Not going to happen. But we also need to make sure that what we're putting back in is clean. So we need to have some kind of way of putting it into an isolated recovery environment, or test what we're recovering first before we put it back in. Otherwise, we're just going to have this this loop where we recover things and it gets reinfected tomorrow and everything else like that. So, but taking it seriously is one thing that I see organizations do. Is like, yeah, we've got backup. We put it in 10 years ago. We're expecting it to last 15 years. So we've got another 5 years left on this, right? But 15 years or 10 years ago, the threats were different. The way you were protecting data is different. You're doing periodically, probably once a day, maybe twice a day if you're really, really keen. But we're seeing now organizations, but the organizations that I work for now, we're doing protection every 4 or 5 seconds to minimize that amount of data loss, because data is gold, it's oil, it's everything, right? And as Jeremy said, your route that you're running on your Strava each day or everything else, they give you this information, they give you these applications because the data behind it is valuable to them, right? They don't give you these applications for free. You are the price essentially you pay for these free applications, right? So getting that data in the right hands is very valuable to commercial companies, but also in the wrong hands can be very bad as well. So making sure that we have up-to-date data, we're not losing 24 hours, we're not losing 36 hours, or even longer amount of data, because that will cripple a business now. So I think recovering at scale, recovering hopefully to minutes before something has happened, or seconds if you can, to minimize the data loss, and test it. I think those 3 things are critical, and probably those 3 things alone is why a lot of organizations fail, because they're not doing it at scale, they're not doing it well enough or frequently enough, and they're not testing it frequently enough as well. So when something does go wrong, they don't know they can recover, they don't know the timescales, and they lose too much data.
And let me follow. Go ahead, Jerry.
Sorry, I'd say I'd probably add a couple of things there, because Chris's points are absolutely great. I think the first one he brought up there, which is recovery point objective. You have to do what's right for your business. It doesn't help if you've got a week-long backup and you're a bank, you lose all of those transactions. You can just imagine the bank is not in sync, and you can never recreate those. So understanding what needs to be in place. 2 other things I'd probably point out there. The first one is you do want segregation between your production and your backup, and even the people who have the authority. I mean, imagine for a second that I used a phishing mail. I compromised someone in the production environment. And now what I do as an attacker, if I'm going to put ransomware in there, my first thought is going to be to go after and see if I can find any source of backup and corrupt that backup. Because if I can do that, then guess what? You'll pay me the Bitcoin that I want. Whereas if I know you've got a simple backup somewhere offsite, and I can't get access to it, or not necessarily offsite, because that doesn't make real sense in the reality of today, but it could be distributed on an S3 bucket, but with somebody with different privilege access. So even if I compromised access in one, I don't get access to that backup. The scary thing, however, is getting a little bit more intelligent about what's going on in your environment is becoming more important, because what I'm starting to see is that we have ransomware that has the ability to keep itself quiet for a period of time. So think about it, just keeps quiet for 2 weeks. That means your backup from yesterday, even if you restored, a day later, it's going to be corrupt again. And it's just going to keep going back and back and back. So basically, you need the ability to find those issues and to start looking at anomalous behavior over and above just backups.
All right. So, Chris, is there a way to scan the backups to make sure that they are, in fact, free of malware, or is it kind of a hope and pray kind of situation?
There's definitely ways of scanning those. I think the problem with scanning backups is a lot of the tech that's out there at the moment is just looking for anomalous changes, right? So and from what I've heard in the industry, it throws up a lot of false positives, a lot of things where that it looks like anomalous activity, but actually it's just month end running, right? So the guys that are looking after it, kind of, it's a bit like boy who cries wolf, right? So eventually you get desensitized to those alerts. So I think it should be multi-layered, right? If we can do something on the front end before it gets to the backup system, that's going to be the best way to do it, because by the time that your backup system has told you it's in there, it's probably in there already, right? So now you've got malware not in your production environment, you also got it in your disaster recovery or your backup environment as well. So now you've got a problem. If you can catch it on the front end, and then either stop your backups or then you've got a problem. You can then look at your backups and then test them in an isolated recovery environment, scan them, whatever tool you want to scan them with, whatever it may be. I don't like saying to people that backup and disaster recovery and data protection vendors are security vendors, right? Pretending to be security vendors, because they have some cool security features. But I wouldn't be saying to any, CISO or any security officer out there, hey, you don't need any of those cool, cool security tools you bought. Just rely on your backup product, right? I think it needs to be multi-layered, and you need to be able to trust the tools you've got in the front door before it gets all the way through, right? Like the way I see it is like, your data protection and your backup is kind of like your house insurance, right? You've got it there, and it's great, you have it. But you still have alarms in your house, you still have locks on your doors, you still have cameras around, right? And you still have people letting people in and out and all that kind of stuff, right? So just because you've got house insurance, don't leave all the doors and the windows open for letting them come in, and make sure you know who is coming in and what they're doing and everything else like that. So I think front end security is very, very important. But it's great if your backup tool could potentially tell you as well, but I wouldn't be relying on it 100%, because it's probably only detecting block changes or something that has looks like it's a virus, but it might not be, right? And then if you get desensitized to it, all it takes is one person to click that and say, yeah, acknowledge, it's probably just nothing, and kind of ignore it. And then suddenly that one time is the time that it's in there, and you go to restore it and you've ignored it and you've got a problem.
All right. Well, Chris, let me follow up with this then. If I look inside of most organizations, the person who has the least amount of experience and makes the least amount of money is in charge of backups and recovery. So,
Exactly.
Is that part of our flaws here, is that we, don't take it seriously enough in the context of a security framework? And is there some better way to think about this and maybe automate the whole thing end to end, for all I know?
Yeah, I still think there's an element of needs to be a human nature in there. I think AI and ML has come a long way and helped us massively, right, with all the anomaly detection, everything else it can do, and we wouldn't go back to before having that, absolutely not. But I think taking things seriously, absolutely, people. No one's dream job is to become a backup admin, right? Like you kind of work your way through the ranks, and if you are a backup admin, I apologize, but no one wakes up in the morning really wanting to look at backup reports all day, every day, right? There's a means to an end, and I think because those people are maybe more junior, or they they're kind of working their way through IT, they're not getting the support or anything else like that. But I think hopefully as cybersecurity and backup and recovery kind of come in, starting to get more highlighted, and we're starting to see CISOs and security officers and CTOs and all those types of people start looking at the backup and recovery tools more seriously, and the personnel using them, right, and making sure their house is in order. Because not only will cyber insurance not cover you if that house isn't in order and things like that, but that's going to be your last line of defense. So I think it's getting taken more seriously now. I think inherently it wasn't. It was always a tick box exercise, and it was only user data, right? It wasn't really. It was like, oh, if we lose a few files, we can just recreate those files. It's not a massive issue. It's it's a user, we can do that. But as we now see, it's potentially whole organizations that get locked out, or critical national infrastructure that gets caught out. So it's not just about user files and things like that anymore. So I think historically it was a forgotten area of the businesses, and or lower down on people's priorities, and I think it's starting to work its way back up again, especially as ransomware is now probably the biggest threat to most organizations out there. It doesn't matter where you live, where you are, whether you have a remote copy of your data or not, ransomware goes everywhere, and if it's connected by a wire, you're vulnerable, right? So yeah, I think it's moving in the right direction. I think we still got a way to go, in my opinion, to get backup and recovery in the right place, but it's working its way up the ladder, absolutely.
Mike, I'll just add three things there, if you don't mind. Because I think what Chris said is so fundamentally important, which is defense in depth. We need multiple layers of defense because you're going to have attackers that are going to have capabilities to get through different areas. So most people will understand, for instance, the basic stuff, like you have an antivirus as an example. And the antivirus is connected to some registry where it's got a whole bunch of known CVEs or known vulnerabilities out there that things take advantage of. And if it starts to see that behavior or that signature, it will give an alert and block it. But then what you have is you have both user behavior and server or entity behavioral analytics, which is becoming so much more important. And that's at that front end, as Chris was saying. What makes something quick and easy is early detection, because if you have ransomware coming into environments and you spot it move from one, because they come in, they move laterally, and you're able to isolate it in one or two of your, let's say, devices or containers or whatever server that you're sitting with, then your response to it is far easier. So when you're thinking about ransomware, you're not only thinking about, do I pull it up from backups? You also think about how quickly do I identify it so that I can contain it. So behavioral analytics is basically saying, you as a user, you use this machine, and all of a sudden you're speaking and you're sending requests to another machine that you don't normally speak to. So it would flag that and obviously bring that into your security operations center, and you'd be able to respond and investigate and hopefully give you that speed. Or an entity, it would be the same thing, saying this device all of a sudden is trying to do something like create a PID that sits next to a system file. So basically copying files in places that it shouldn't do, or generating new files, or trying to reach the registry. And that's not normal for that server or that device to do. Again, initiates that process. The last thing I would say that does become very important to me is the concept of segregation. So you don't want all of your environments in one open, let's say, VPC in AWS or one open network, so that if I get into the one side and I'm a self-propagating ransomware, that I can spread across your whole environment. You create logical segmentation so that if you have a disruption in one area, it's only impacting part of your business. So that's another fundamental. So that defense in depth, it's not just backup, it's how you prepare in advance for if it's coming in. And the fundamental to any hack, attack, or ransomware is, can I get early notification? Because one thing I'll guarantee you, Mike, is you will never, ever be able to stop every virus coming in, every 0 day that gets affected, but your ability to quickly identify how you respond to it, of which response is critical to have good backup strategy. That's fundamental to whether you survive or not.
Yeah, I think.
Do you think as part of that? Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, no, I completely agree with what Jeremy said. Some great points. And I think on the same lines is that kind of logical separation is diversifying that data portfolio as well, right? We've seen ransomware attacks going after VMware files, right? Going after the VMDKs. So like you store all your stuff in VMDKs, right? You even store your backups in VMDKs. So it doesn't matter what backup you're using, it's going to go and look for that particular type. Whereas if we can store it in VMDKs, we can then potentially store it in S3 bucket. We can potentially store it in an Azure blob storage, right? And then we could store it in maybe some another protocol. It's going to be even more difficult and add extra complexity for attackers to be able to understand your network and say, right, I need to write an exploit to encrypt VMDKs. I need to now write an exploit to encrypt S3 buckets. I now need to figure out how I do Azure blobs as well. So storing data in multiple different places, obviously logically and geographically, but also potentially in different formats as well, I'm not saying it's perfect. It's never going to, as Jeremy said, you're never going to stop them completely, right? These people are very clever. They're going to find ways of getting at it. But if you can slow them down, if you notice that VMDKs have been encrypted, potentially then you can start looking at securing those environments or figuring out what's going on right before they manage to get to the other environments, or you still got a clean copy of your data to recover to. So yeah.
All right, it's kind of like that guy who hides the pee in the cups and you switch them around, and then eventually nobody knows where it is. Jeremy, we've been dealing with silos in IT forever. Do you think that one of the issues that needs to be addressed inside of these organizations is the security team and the IT ops team has to come closer together to kind of build something that does feel like a response or an incident management plan for this stuff? Because ultimately, right now, it seems like everybody's running two separate playbooks.
That's very interesting. And I come from a background, I've done a lot of work in backgrounds in both telecom and OT environments, which is operational technology, which generally, we were speaking about this earlier, like with critical infrastructure, you have two separate teams. You've got an IT team and you've got an operations team or an engineering team that goes in and builds those out. And in the past, you've had the security team that sits as a subsection across IT, as an example, or in a silo on the right-hand side of IT. What's really shifting now is because OT and critical infrastructure is all becoming IT, is the role of security really needs to expand across an organization. It needs to be a role that goes across your technology arm. It needs to integrate with physical security and corporate security. It needs to integrate with IT and operations. let's take a simple scenario. For most of us, we had this COVID come up, and everyone had to go work remotely all of a sudden. And now you had some people that had to go back into the building to get equipment, and you had some people that weren't allowed in the building, and some were authorized, and you had these different work schedules. So people got really creative with how the workforce is actually going to operate. Now, so let's take a look at what that means for all three entities. If we take physical security, cyber security, and IT, you need to get equipment from IT to individuals, but the corporate security needs to understand who's allowed on-site and not on-site. So, for instance, you saw that an individual's IP, or their PC, let's say their MAC address that's supposed to be off-site, all of a sudden connects to a work office. You now know there's an issue. Or you know somebody's maybe not in the geographical zone, their IP address, they were 1 hour in Colorado, and then in the next hour they were sitting with Chris in London, as an example. It just geographically doesn't make sense. So what happens there is we've been working in these silos, but those triggers that you're finding should be alerting the corporate security guys to understand that there could be a physical threat taking place here, or vice versa. That you may have someone on site that's not supposed to be on site, someone that's not authorized to be there. And really what we need to get is a unison of response that comes across all of those aspects. That's IT operations like ITSM, cybersecurity, and corporate security. And what's fundamentally been missing in the past that I think this is where, and not to try poke, but Everbridge does a really good job at doing, is bringing in response in a unified, consolidated manner. Being able to visualize all these components in one location. So you have a central command center, for instance. You can map the different triggers that need to be brought into each other. But also the most fundamental thing in crises or disasters, depending on what you're dealing with, whether it's a cyber incident, a physical incident, is the ability to get out communication timelessly to the right person and know that they received it so they can take action. Even if you don't have a playbook to deal with something, if you get the message and you have the right people, they can sit and figure it out. It's going to take them a bit longer than what they would have done if they had the right playbook and had it automatically generated. But if you can manage those communications, get the notification to the people that need the notification when the time counts, that's the most fundamental thing you can do in recovery. Because that's getting your backup people ready. It's getting your cyber analysts in there. It's getting your forensics guys. It's getting your security coordinator, knowing that there could be someone on site on the premise that shouldn't be there. It's coordinating all those aspects in a central location. So for me, I'd say, to your point, silos have existed. I think the first place of merging in terms of those silos needs to be on coordination and communication. It doesn't have to be on day-to-day jobs, but certainly on coordination. Because what we're seeing, as we spoke about earlier, is this hybrid attack. If you think about somebody that's attacking using physical and digital, and we're trying to respond individually with digital responses and then physical responses separately, if we're operating a silo, they're already a step ahead of us. And we're on the back foot because we're not coordinating across the aspects. So for me, it is an evolution that's taking place. People are getting a lot more serious about coordinating response. It's not anymore you're going to have a knock, and separately, you're going to have a SOC, and then you're going to have a physical response. You're going to be bringing all of those together into an integrated virtual response center.
Chris, do you agree with that? And I just would like to point out one thing, because it is a pet peeve of mine. I've been doing this too long, but every year for 30 years, I've watched the annual CIO top priority list come out. And every year, somewhere between the third and the sixth slot is disaster recovery. And it doesn't seem like we make any progress whatsoever from one year to the next on disaster recovery. So how do we get to what Jeremy described as a way to think about disaster recovery as a part of our incident response motion? And what is it going to take to actually, get these processes to meld together?
Yeah, I think it's always there because it's hard to do, right? Like the stuff gets ticked off quicker than disaster recovery, because traditionally disaster recovery has meant, maybe a week of interruption to business, or a week of IT ops doing everything and getting all these people in one place and to do these paper exercises and potentially failing over applications to a secondary place or the cloud over. But I mean, tooling's is advanced a lot now. Like, the company I work for, Zerto, we can automate all of that for you. So your DR testing can happen in minutes, anytime during the day. So that kind of tech part of it can be can be handled by technology and automation, orchestration, etc. But what Jeremy mentioned, that kind of stuff still needs to happen, right? Like we go into organizations all the time, and obviously I'm in disaster recovery and backup and ransomware recovery, and I like to play the what if game, right? So like, okay, what if this happens? And they say I can do this. I'm like, what if you don't have this? Like, okay, we're gonna send an email. What if you don't have email? Oh, well, I'll send a text. Okay, what if your cell tower's down? You know, all these things, and people don't think about it. We're like, okay, we've got an incident response plan. Where is it stored? Oh, it's stored in our SharePoint. Okay, what if you don't have the internet, you don't have access to your SharePoint. So where are you storing? So it's an evolution, and I don't think we're ever going to nail it 100%, right? But I think what Jerry mentioned earlier, communication and getting the people in the right places, knowing what their jobs are, and actually understanding their roles and being able to be empowered to take that action when they need to, right? And that only comes from I suppose I say testing, but rehearsing, I suppose, is a better way of doing it, and actually saying, right, your job is this, and actually it's okay if it's a false alarm for whatever reason and you cause 6 hours worth of disruption to a business, right? Because security is important. So we'd much rather have 6 hours of disruption for a false something happened than 6 days worth of business offline because someone is getting there, or all of our data gets leaked on the internet because of something happened, right? So having those people empowered and not fearing that they're going to press the wrong button or do something wrong is important. But rehearsal is key, and making sure that people know not where they need to be, but I suppose what their roles are, and who they need to be talking to, which part of the business is responsible for what. Because is it the security team, is it the SOC, is it the NOC? Okay, all these things are kind of gelling and overlapping now, because the NOC might get an alert that the SOC should have got because maybe the backup product has told them that something's gone. It's something they're looking at, right? But the NOC guys are saying, well, the backups worked fine. Who do I need to tell? Do I need to tell just someone in the SOC? Do I need to tell the CISO? Understanding those workflows and making sure that everyone understands what their roles are in the business. Because if we're not talking, as Jeremy said earlier, they're already ahead, right? They know which part of the organization isn't talking to which silos they can attack first to distract, and then which ones are weakened because they're not up to date. Physical security often gets overlooked because it's just putting a security guard right in front of a data center. Well, actually, no, right? We've got biometrics and all these things. We should be looking at all of those aspects for disaster recovery. The tech side of it, yes, we can do that, absolutely, and we can test that. But actually, making sure people talk is probably more important, and making sure people have a plan. I'm still a fan of having it printed off in the boot of important people's cars, right? Like, or somewhere you can get access to. As the worst case scenario is, you go at home or you go to your car, you can pull out what you need to do, and you've got a list of telephone numbers you can ring and figure out what's happened like that. I'm sure there's much better ways of doing it, but when things do happen, and when the worst case scenario is there, you'd be glad that you've got a bit of paper that tells you who's responsible for what somewhere, right? So yeah.
Maybe you got a copy of a backup tape in the boot of the car too with that, right? Yeah. Jeremy, we have a question I think I'm going to direct to you, but I'd also like Chris to throw in his 2 cents. One of our attendees wants to know, how do you extend this out to service providers? Because we're so dependent upon third parties these days. So how do I kind of connect them and bring them into this whole workflow? And especially if the vulnerability is coming from their platforms instead of mine.
Very good question, Mike. And I think the first thing that we make a big mistake on is we try to treat all vendors as the same. So when we're looking at supply chain resilience, when we're looking at building partnerships with our vendors, we really need to understand what they deliver for us. So just like when you do a business impact assessment on your priority of your business and what it needs, a massive component of that should be your third parties. And those third parties is supply chain, whether it's providing you microchips that you need to build your phone that you're producing, whether it's a vendor providing you with, let's say, a SaaS WAF or CDN capability that you have in your ecosystem. The key aspect there is understanding and classifying. And once you understand which ones are critical vendors or ones that would impact your business significantly, that potentially don't have alternatives in place, that's when you really make sure that your contracting with those vendors is tight. You want to have in your contracts very clearly stipulated integration points for notification awareness, for integration of incident management. And then you want to trial and test those. I think Chris brought the point up earlier. You can have the best plans, you can have the best backups. If you don't test them, you don't know that they work. So you should be conducting integrated tests with your key vendors. And this includes people like AWS? What happens if West goes out? Do we fail over to East? Work in collaboration and actually run them. And we've seen that some of these mega vendors can be impacted at that mega scale. I mean, it's been proven to us now in recent years. And requesting that you participate or requesting more from your vendors is becoming something that's kind of standardized and norm. Even if you speak to a lot of the lawyers that are putting together contracts these days, those security sections, or it's not only security, it's resiliency sections, compliance sections, they're being expanded significantly. And you really have to justify why not to produce them, if that makes sense. So the first thing I would say in summary is understanding your vendors, classifying them, determine the associated risk, and then within the applicable ones, make sure that you're building the partnerships, you've got the contractual terms, and you exercise whatever it is that you want. It's too often that we say, this is a critical vendor. We've got some term in a contract to satisfy our security or our PCI or our FedRAMP compliance, whatever it is that you need. But nobody actually goes and asks for that plan. Nobody ever goes and conducts the assessment or does the actual test that they're supposed to do, even though it's stipulated in a statement of work, as an example. So my point would be that third-party risk management program that you have, it should be part of your vendor risk management, and it should be a live program that is busy being run. No organization should be in place without a third-party risk management program or vendor risk management program today.
All right, Chris, you want to add to that? Because in my experience, the so-called service level agreement isn't often worth much more than the paper it was written on in the first place. But is there a way to think about this differently?
I think the first thing for me is to highlight that no matter what vendor you're storing your data in or service provider, at the end of the day, it's still your data. Like you can trust people inherently, and as you said, the SLA can be watertight and the contract will be tight. Great. But what happens when the data gets lost? It's your responsibility for your data. So make sure you have protections in place, right? So as Jerry mentioned earlier, AWS, Azure, Microsoft, Google, they all have problems, right? We've seen AWS multiple times have outages for various different reasons, and that's fine. We all know that IT goes wrong. That's why people have jobs, right, to fix it, because IT goes wrong and things do happen. But having a plan and making sure we're just not, well, if Amazon goes down, loads of other people are going to be affected. Well, great. Well, maybe you don't have to be one of those people. You can be one of the ones that have got a great plan in place, right. And maybe your competitors are down and you can still be running, right? That's going to be a key advantage to you as well. So making sure that you're protecting your data in the platform you've chosen. And then also understanding from your suppliers what they're doing, as Jeremy mentioned, like what's their disaster recovery plan? If you're building disaster, if you're buying, if you're buying disaster recovery as a service from a service provider with a tier 1 SLA, ask them what they're doing for their disaster recovery, right? Because they might be selling you this service that's spent, it's $100,000 a year, whatever it may be, right? Ask them what they're using. Because if they're trying to sell you a tool they're not using themselves, ask the question why, right? If they're, because if you're going to fail over onto their infrastructure, what are they using? What's their SLAs? Making sure you actually understand the tooling they're using. But I think Jeremy kind of had some very important points with making sure you understand which vendors do what are critical, which ones aren't, which ones do you need to talk to in a critical infrastructure or an incident management plan, and which ones you can wait to talk to, because everyone's going to be wanting to talk to at some point, admittedly, but making sure that if your business relies on microchips, as Jerry mentioned, that's going to be the people you want to talk to first, right? Because if without them you don't have a business. I kind of come back to this minimal viable business each time. Whenever something happens, you need to get whatever that minimum viable business back up and running as quickly as possible, and once you've got that, everything else can probably follow. But once you need to make sure you understand what that is from your business point of view, and then make sure or your vendors or your third-party contractors or your provider, your service providers, if they're aligned to that, making sure they're kind of in conjunction with you and on the same journey, right? It's okay you saying you have a 1-hour SLA to get things back up and running, but if your provider has a 5-hour SLA, then you're going to be hitting their SLA rather than yours.
Yeah. And sometimes, to Chris's point, the penalty that's in the contract for the third-party provider is less than what it would cost them to implement the infrastructure. So they'd rather just take the penalty.
Mm-hmm. And we hear a lot, too, about SOC certifications. Is that worth the time and effort to go check service providers out to make sure they're SOC 2 compliant, or is it too easy to become SOC 2 compliant? It doesn't mean much. Jeremy, what do you say?
I think my response to this question is you can be an organization that is there to become compliant, and you can become compliant without being secure. Let me just differentiate those two things. That does not take away from the fact that it is a really good benchmark to have multiple compliance, whether that's PCI, FedRAMP, ISO, SOC. They're really good to have a framework which shows that there is a team, there's repetitive processes, there's the ability, so it does go a long way. But I will say this again, being compliant does not mean someone is secure. A lot of people, a lot of organizations may choose to build programs to become compliant as opposed to building programs to become secure. And I think that's something we need to understand. We need to first put security forward and the ability to recover, the ability to be resilient, the ability to, even if that third-party WAF provider fails, do we have an alternative strategy? Can we use an AWS WAF and bring it up within 2 hours? I don't know. But the point is, we definitely need that ability to do it. And I don't know. In my opinion, I think becoming compliant is something we have to do. Being secure is something we need to want to do and be part of the actual culture itself.
Yeah. Chris, as part of that, we hear a lot about zero trust IT these days. Is that something that is really attainable at this point, or is that aspirational? Because we used to kind of say, let's lock down all the hardware, but then no one would let us lock down the hardware. So now we're trying to lock down the software. But it seems to me you just can't go roll out of bed and say, I'm going to go get me some zero trust IT today. So what do we mean here, and what's the goal?
Yeah, I think zero trust. I mean, I work in technical marketing, so I'm probably guilty for this. But zero trust has kind of been banded around as it's been coined as a marketing phrase now, right? So it's definitely aspirational. You can never have, in my opinion, I mean, I'm happy to be proven wrong by people much cleverer than me, but I think zero trust is something that we can never truly get to, right? So I've been on a call with some analysts and some other people recently, and I was explaining, ransomware recovery and all these other things. And like, what happens if the the BIOS gets ransomware? Someone put us on the BIOS. I'm like, okay, well then you don't have to flash the BIOS and redo it. And what happens if the chip code gets infected? And I'm like, okay, well then how far do you go down before you can have this zero trust truly, right? Because something has to trust something at some point, and I think that the threat actors are changing. So yeah, zero trust is great, but I'm sure at some point they'll probably find a way to make sure it's trusted, right? They'll find a way to intercept, right? To do something that we haven't thought of, right? That we thought we were secure 10 years ago and we thought we were done, and now we're still having this conversation about how we secure nowadays. So I think zero trust is important. I think if people can get there, and I think the separation, logical separation, as Jerry mentioned earlier, is equally, like, if you can separate out things so it doesn't impact your whole business, that's going to be, I say just as good, but it's that things are always going to happen. Things are going to go wrong. I think people think that security teams fail when something goes wrong. No, they've stopped 99.999% of the things that happen on a daily basis, right? All they've got to do is let slip once. That's not a failure. That's going to happen. How we architect and how we respond to that, early detection, as Jerry mentioned earlier, segregation. So if we lose 25% of our business, we can still operate 75% of it. That's okay. And also the recovery time for 25% is a hell of a lot quicker than 100%. So logical separation, and I'm sure zero trust people, want to go there. I wouldn't say it's the be all and end all. I wouldn't everyone go and rush out and get zero trust for everything you possibly have, because that's going to solve every one of your problems. I don't think that's going to happen. But I think it's an important methodology or framework if you can get there.
Jeremy, you talked about the bad guys using AI, but it looks like the good guys are thinking about using AI for anomaly detection to identify a ransomware attack in progress and shut it down as quickly as possible. So I know we're all focused on treating the proverbial disease, but might we get to a point someday where we actually cure this thing and we don't have ransomware at all? Is that possible in your mind?
Well, let's start with your first part of that question. Is yes, most certainly we utilize artificial intelligence and ML in defensive mechanisms. That's how you spot behavioral analytics. These computations, there are billions happening continuously, and being able to find out which one seems to be anomalous versus not. It's not as simple as just saying, hey, this is a known bad signature, which is kind of how it was done in the past. We found it. It's doing the same thing. We need to remember that this whole concept of 0 day, let's not talk zero trust, which is there are new vulnerabilities that are exposed on an ongoing basis and new ways to get into systems because we're continuously building, continuously identifying holes in the solutions, and then patching and building. So that's a cycle that's going to happen on an ongoing basis. I think we'll get to a point that we will not have ransomware? We will have different mechanisms of breach because that's what the human nature and then artificial intelligence will actually be built to do, is find those. And it's all about bug fix. I mean, this goes back to the old days where we'd build some code and they would go try test it against a bunch of bugs to see if I can exploit it. I mean, we do this on an ongoing basis. I think the one shift, however, that industry really needs to make is the use of open source teams and crowdsource and crowd capabilities to actually do resolution. If you find, let's take an example. If we take like any one of the recent viruses or vulnerabilities that have been exposed, the big difference is there's one issue that's identified and all of a sudden it becomes public on the internet. Now we have hundreds of thousands of professionals working on how to actually turn this into an even worse attack vector and expose even more and trip it up, find all the different ways that it can be utilized. So the pace at which a 0 day grows in terms of complexity is exponential because we have so many people working on it after that first discovery. Whereas in security, I feel like industries are still very tight. I don't really share information. If I had a breach in my environment, I'm not going to sit and make that so public because I'm afraid I'm going to look bad. And it's completely wrong. As communities, how do we expect to be defending against this exponential growth with the millions of or hundreds of thousands of people working on a particular virus at a point in time, and we're going to try as individual teams of 10 or 50, or depending on what you're doing, or let's say a vendor that's got 100 people trying to analyze it. And we're doing it in these isolated little buckets and not sharing amongst each other because we do want a competitive advantage and we want to be able to, A, not look silly, or as a vendor, have a unique competitive advantage to the rest of them. We're just not going to keep up with that. So you talk about artificial intelligence as an answer. I think before we even get to artificial intelligence being the be-all, end-all, we need to get to more of a network of individuals that solve problems in a similar way to the way that we currently use massive global networks to advance problems. But I think as a human nature, we've got some way to go there and need to find out a way of how we actually bridge those with trust barriers and so forth.
All right. So sunshine is still the best form of disinfectant. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
All right. Chris, there's a lot going on out there. What's your best advice to folks in terms of combating these threats or getting in front of all this? I mean, what should folks be thinking about right now?
I think I don't think I can give one bit of advice that's going to change people's lives, right? And I think any vendor or any organization out there that says they've got the golden bullet to do this is lying. Frankly, I think it comes in layers, right? So don't forget about the basics. You know, it's very important and very easy to get distracted by AI, ML, the new stuff that's on the block, and it's going to protect you from 0 day attacks. Like, it's very easy to get distracted by that stuff and then slip up on something that you've left an RDP port open to the internet, or something that happens on a regular basis, right? Yep, 0 day attacks do happen, absolutely. They do infect people, and they are vulnerable. But the whole 0 day, it's 0 day for everybody. So even the people who are trying to infect systems, they've still got to learn it as well, right? Whereas if it's been out for 6 months, 6 years, they've had all that practice to do it. So make sure you're concentrating on the basics, as well as looking at the new shiny things and everything else. You know, security is cool, and hopefully unlimited budgets for security in the future and everything else like that. But just because the next tool's available doesn't mean you don't have to still do the basic things, right? You know, the signature scanner, yeah, it's not sexy anymore. It's still that, but it still serves a purpose, right? It still serves a purpose for identifying that stuff. So do the basics well, and you'll probably halve your problems by doing the basics really, really well. I think backup and recovery strategies should be higher on people's priority lists. Treat them with the respect they deserve, because they will be your last line of defense when something goes wrong, right? So making sure we are testing those on a regular basis, making sure we understand that what our RPO SLA is, what our RTO SLA should be. And actually, asking the business to challenge them. Very, very frequently, I'll ask people what their RPO and RTOs would be, and I've said, where have you got them from? And I've got a response from, well, the IT team told me that's what they can achieve. Well, that's great, but that might be the tool they put in 10 years ago or 5 years ago, and that's all they can do now, right? Or that's what they think they can do. And actually, if they're a bank and you've got 24-hour RPO, you might as well say goodbye if you have something go wrong, because no one's gonna that's not viable anymore. So making sure that the business drive the outcomes they want, and then look for the tooling or the provider or the help they need to get to where they want to be, because there will be people out there that can help you. And I think that is the last point I want to say is, don't think you have to do this alone, right? There's vendors, there's providers, there's communities out there who have been through this and know how to do things. Like, obviously, we have a lot of disaster recovery and ransomware recovery as a service providers out there who deal with ransomware on a daily basis, right? They have hundreds of customers who get hit or have been hit, so they know what to do. They're well versed in it. They understand what they need to do. They understand the procedures and everything else. So just because you're a Fortune 250 or a Fortune 100 company, it doesn't mean you can't go and ask for help from outside communities, right? So I think that kind of points into what Jeremy said earlier, right? We always look at these silos and it's down to my security team to solve this. Well, what happens if every security team was working together to solve these things? Wouldn't we get things done a lot quicker? And sharing our experiences as well. It's incredibly difficult to get any organization to put their hands up and say we had a breach or we were hit with ransomware. Here's what we learned. They'll probably just keep that as an internal lessons learned document on a SharePoint somewhere for their own sake, but will never share that publicly and say, hey, yeah, we left the port open, or we did this, we got hit by this, or one thing we wish we did better was this. That kind of stuff doesn't really get shared because of the shame or the someone's going to turn it or use it into a bad news story or something. But I think if we can kind of get rid of that stigma, that's going to help people learn, because as humans, we learn from mistakes, right? We make mistakes all the time. We learn from them. That should be the same in IT and security, right? We make mistakes, or maybe we don't realize we're making a mistake at the time, but then in hindsight, we look back and say, we could have done better. We should have done that. And if we shared that, that might have helped 50, 100, 250 other organizations going through the same thing and saying, oh God, actually, I'm going to do the same as what that guy did, because I don't want to be that guy.
All right. Jeremy, you got any closing thoughts on the same subject? I wonder, do we just make it too easy for the bad guys? And maybe, a lot of this stuff is just low-hanging fruit.
Look, I'd say my biggest advice I can give to individuals and organizations is that security is not the responsibility of the security team alone. I mean, a lot of people think, oh, we've got those 20 or 30 guys sitting over there in that corner. They're going to protect us. Security is the responsibility of every single employee that is out there. Because if I'm an attacker and I have done a fair share of my own white hacking in the past, it is far easier for me to come and social engineer an individual and get access to all those crown jewels than what it is to break through all those layers of defense that Chris was talking about and then get to the backups. If someone can give me the keys to the house, I mean, you can have the best locks on the doors, you can have cameras, you can have heat sensors, you can have all these things. But if you give me the code or the keys to enter in the front door, that's a much easier approach. So being phished, somebody thinking that they had a call from their organization's, let's say, IT support to come help them remotely upload or patch their computer. If you did not request help, don't trust it. So the one bit of advice is be suspicious when you're clicking in an email, when you're opening an email, when somebody sends you a WhatsApp, when somebody sends you a link on any form of text message, or if somebody's reaching out to you as a vendor, or if they're reaching out to you as your own IT department. If you never, ever requested the help, be suspicious and don't accept it.
All right, cool. Hey, guys, our hour's up. And like I told you, this would just fly by. I want to thank you both for sharing your knowledge and insights today. And I'm going to hand it back over to Cody.
Thank you, Mike. And thank you, Chris and Jeremy, both for being here with us today. I'd like to remind our audience that this panel was recorded. You'll receive a link you should receive an email with a link to access the recording on demand. You can also record it on the Security Boulevard website. Just visit securityboulevard.com/webinars and be sure to look in the on-demand section. So we do have 4 $25 Amazon gift cards to give out. Our first winner is Rick Mod O. Our second winner is Breeza D. Our third winner is Mark B. And our fourth and final winner is Yoga D. So to the four of you, congratulations. Keep an eye on your inbox to claim that gift card. And if you don't receive an email, just check your spam folder. Before we close out, I would like to ask our audience to stick around for one extra moment to fill out a brief post-webinar survey. It should pop up on your screen here in just a moment. But otherwise, thank you all for being here, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.